Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It's Tuesday, and I'm happy to be with you once again. I got to talk to you twice last week, which was always exciting. This week, just one interview, so talking to you on my usual Tuesday. I hope you had a great weekend. Mine was fine. I always say that. It's hilarious. I know going in when I start my intro and to all the episodes, I'm like, I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about this. And then I get to the weekend part and I'm like, I have no idea what I did this weekend, even though I just went over it in my head. I should write things down, although it always seems like, I'll remember it at the time. I hung out with our friends who were visiting from the UK, took them shopping Saturday morning, and that is always fun. I just like to wander around and look at things, and I don't necessarily shop a lot, but I like to wander around. So we went and they needed to get some household items, and then we went grocery shopping, and always very exciting stuff. And then Sunday, I hung out with them again for a little bit, and they fed me dinner, which was very, very sweet. They're very kind people, so I'm appreciative of them feeding me. And then they beat me soundly at cards again, always, every time we play. I have never won against this group when we play cards. They love to play phase 10, so if you're familiar with that game, I have never won. I win individual phases now and then, but even that's rare. So I must just... Part of it's luck, I know that, but I also must just have absolutely no strategy skills. But doesn't matter. It's still fun. We hang out, we laugh, we chat, and we play cards, and they feed me. So really cannot complain about that. But let's talk about the book for today. The author is Robert Hofler that I am speaking with, and the book is about the movie, as I mentioned last episode, about the movie The Way We Were. And I want to make sure I get the title right. I say it also in the interview, but I want to make sure I get it right every time. It's called The Way They Were: How Epic Battles and Bruised Egos Brought a Classic Hollywood Love Story to the Screen. And so if you are unfamiliar with The Way They Were, it's a 1973 movie, so that means this is 50 years, the 50-year anniversary. It has a great cast. It's starring Robert Redford and Barbra Streisand. And here is the description of the book. Coinciding with the 50th anniversary of The Way We Were, this intriguing and impeccably researched book is the first ever account of the making of the classic film starring Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford, revealing the full story behind its genesis and continued controversies, its many deleted scenes, its much anticipated but never filmed sequel, and the real-life romance that inspired this groundbreaking love story. It's one of the greatest movie romances of all time. 50 years on, the chemistry between Barbra Streisand as Jewish working-class firebrand Katie Worosky and Robert Redford as all-American golden boy Hubble Gardner remains potent. Yet the friction and controversy surrounding The Way We Were was so enormous, the movie was nearly never made at all. Screenwriter Arthur Lawrence wrote the role of Katie with Streisand in mind. Casting Hubble was another matter. Redford, already a superstar, was reluctant to play what he perceived as the Ken doll to Streisand's lead, and demanded his role be changed and expanded. Lawrence resisted, telling director Sidney Pollack, "You'll ruin the movie if it ends up being about two people. It's Katie's story, not Hubble's." Despite his protests, 10 writers, among them Francis Ford Coppola, were brought on to rework the script. Lawrence's fears were well-founded, and the first preview was disastrous. Producer Ray Stark and Pollack, with Redford's approval, cut several scenes, upsetting Streisand and Lawrence. Yet the edits worked. Such was the movie's success that Redford was open to making a sequel, though Lawrence's script was never greenlit. Some of those quote-unquote lost scenes are now being restored to the film for its 50th anniversary. It's also the deep, surprising love story at the heart of the way I'm not sure if that's supposed to say the way they were or the way we were. If it's referring to the book or the movie. But it doesn't matter. It's the deep and surprising love story that makes it so memorable. I think it means the movie, so the way we were. And Robert Hofler explores its inspiration, the relationship between Lawrence, a Jewish Brooklyn-born college leftist, and his longtime partner, Tom Hatcher. Drawing on a vast trove of Lawrence and Pollock's unpublished writings, as well as interviews with Streisand, Redford, and other key players, this is the definitive account of a film that changed the rules of movie making and defined romance ever since. So maybe you're familiar with this movie, maybe you've seen it, maybe it's one of your favorites. It came out in 1973, so 2 years before I was born. I'm familiar with the movie. I'm very familiar, as you probably are, with the very memorable, iconic song "Memories" from that movie. If Memories of the Way We Were, title of the movie, right? With Streisand's amazing voice doing that song. So you might be familiar with it, or you might, maybe you've seen it many times. I have not seen this movie, and so I thought I knew more about it than I actually did once I started looking into the movie, and I tried to find a way to watch it. Couldn't find it on any of my streaming services, and so if you are a fan of the movie, or you're a fan of movie trivia, or it's more than trivia. It's movie history. It's the way movies are made. It's all of the things that go on behind the scenes of movies, right? The way that they start as one project and they can end up as one totally different project through all of the changes, through everything that happens with casting and script changes and everything, just like the title says, with battles and bruised egos and all of those things. So if you're at all interested in any of those behind-the-scenes stories, then you are definitely going to want to listen to the interview and, of course, read the book if it is something that you are interested in. So let's go ahead and let Robert tell about the writing of the book, the research that he did, etc. Again, the book is called The Way They Were, and the author is Robert Hofler. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Thank you for being here. I am happy to have you and happy to talk about your book, The Way They Were. Before we talk about the book, though, if you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
My name is Robert Hofler, and for many years, I was an entertainment editor at publications like Life, Us, and Variety. And about 10 years ago, I decided I didn't want to be editing other people's articles anymore. And I had already written a few books, the most famous being The Man Who Invented Rock Hudson, which was about the notorious Hollywood agent Henry Wilson. But I decided I wanted to dedicate myself full-time to writing books and also writing theater reviews, and I'm the lead theater critic for The Wrap. So that is my background.
All right. Thank you. I want to get the full title correct. So the book is The Way They Were, How Epic Battles and Bruised Egos Brought a Classic Hollywood Love Story to the Screen. Can you give an overview of the story? Because it is, of course, based on about the movie The Way We Were.
Well, I think I can kind of do two things at once and talk about why I was interested in this particular movie, and then tell people who haven't seen the movie or haven't seen it recently. I saw the movie shortly after it was released in 1973, and I remember it very vividly because it was the first Christmas Eve I spent away from home. I was going to NYU in New York City at the time, and I was very interested in this movie starring Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford called The Way We Were, because I knew it was about the Hollywood blacklist. And that's when the House on Un-American Activities did an investigation into suspected communists in the Hollywood community, and they actually established a blacklist. So if you were a communist or had been a communist and you did not recant, you could not work in television and movies. I was very interested in this period because I was raised by very conservative parents, and it was my belief that they were strong supporters of Senator Joe McCarthy. Now, Senator Joe McCarthy came on the scene in 1950. The movie The Way We Were is set in 1947, or the major part of it is. And that is when the Streisand character, Katie, and the Robert Redford character, Hubble, have fallen in love and married, and they move to Hollywood so he can pursue his career as a screenwriter. And in order to facilitate that, she has promised him that she will give up her political beliefs or her political activism. Because when they met in college in 1937, pamphleteering as much as she could in America against the war in Spain, the fascist war in Spain with Franco. Those two characters meet again during World War II, and then they fall in love. But most of the movie takes place in 1947 in Hollywood. And I was very interested in that period because of my parents and their strong political beliefs, which I thought were not good political beliefs. Then years later, in 1995, I was working as an entertainment journalist, and I interviewed Sidney Pollack, who directed the movie. And there were these rumors that most of the Hollywood section, or a good hour of it, had been cut out of the movie. And I did an interview with him, and I asked him, is there going to be a director's cut where we see some of that footage? And he told me, no, there wouldn't be a director's cut because the blacklist material set in Hollywood, most of it didn't work. And that's why he cut it out. And he liked the movie the way it was. What I didn't know at that time, and I found out when I was researching this book, is that there are two scenes that to this day, Barbra Streisand has tried to put back in the movie, and Sidney Pollack refused to put them back in. And from my research, I believe that his two daughters have prevented Barbra Streisand from releasing the movie with those two scenes in them. Then I would say in about 2002, I was working as a theater reporter for Variety, and I got to know the screenwriter, Arthur Lawrence. Now, Arthur Lawrence was better known in New York as the book writer for Gypsy and West Side Story. But he also wrote screenplays, and one of those was The Way We Were. And the story around Broadway is that Arthur Lawrence had really written about himself and his 50-year-old love for a man named Tom Hatcher. Now, Arthur Lawrence was politically very liberal and Jewish, and Tom Hatcher was very good-looking, blonde, apolitical, and was kind of the Hubble character. I asked Arthur Lawrence if that was true, and he didn't deny it. But what he said is, basically, I was writing about myself with the Katie character. That's what he told me in an interview in 2002. And that is something that he wrote in his third memoir, which was published posthumously in, I think, 2010. So that's my interest in The Way We Were, that I thought that there were a lot of issues that it raised, both politically, sexually, sociologically, and I just hope that other people would find that interesting too. I mean, as a movie buff, I'm just always excited about learning about the scenes that were cut out of the movie. And if someone has tried to recut the film, like they did with Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, where they found scenes and they re-edited the movie. But that is something Sidney Pollack was not interested in doing.
I think any of us who are movie buffs or love certain movies always like to know some more of the behind the scenes information and the type of things you're talking about. This movie now is 50 years old this year. And as you mentioned, it starts in the 30s, mainly takes place end of the 40s. So it's got a wide time span. What do you hope people might gain from the book, learn from the book, take away from the book?
Most of what I try to do is just to entertain and tell a good story. So I actually think that the making of the movie, because so much went wrong with it, and yet it turned out to be a success, that it's an interesting story. And in fact, it has been optioned for a possible short TV series. It is a unique film in that Streisand is so singular, that here she was, this Jewish actress playing a Jewish character who falls in love with the gorgeous, vapid wasp. And that turned things on its head. Because generally it's, the kind of charismatic but homely man who lands the beautiful babe. And that is, one of the oldest stereotypes, one of the oldest myths in Hollywood that can happen. But rarely do we see it the other way around. I think Woody Allen very much popularized, what was kind of the average looking guy who falls in love with one of the most beautiful women in the world. Now, that had also been done with Humphrey Bogart, with Spencer Tracy, with Jimmy Stewart. And these were men who were falling in love with Katharine Hepburn and Kim Novak and Ingrid Bergman. Many of those women much younger than the men were, and we completely accept it. But with Streisand and Redford, that was something that was very new. And frankly, we don't see it much after that. The movie's kind of singular. It's kind of unique. And then you add into that the whole Jewish Gentile aspect of the story. Now that's something in the opposite way we see a lot of with Woody Allen, with Ben Stiller, with Jerry Seinfeld, with Larry David, where you have the Jewish man who falls in love with the beautiful shiksa. But we don't see the opposite happening, where there is a Jewish woman who falls in love with the shagets. And in fact, I didn't even know what that word meant, shagets. I'd never heard it before. Where shiksa, I have known that word since I moved to New York City 50 years ago. And so I think the movie is quite unique. The only other two examples I can come up with in popular culture where we have a story about the Jewish girl who falls in love with the shagets, that's the Gentile man, is Dirty Dancing with Jennifer Grey and Patrick Swayze. And then you had it a little bit with Lena Dunham with her Girls series. There was one episode where she spent a weekend with, the gorgeous Patrick Wilson in his brownstone in Brooklyn. But, that's not very much when you compare that to the whole oeuvre of Woody Allen and Ben Stiller and Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, all of which was preceded by Goodbye Columbus, which was probably the first of those stories.
Keep this current topic in mind. It is time for our first break of this episode, but we are going to pick right back up with this topic when we come back from that break. So during the break, think if you can come up with any examples of your own of these types of relationships. In the meantime, stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking, as you know, with Robert Hofler about his book, The Way They Were, about the movie The Way We Were. And before the break, he was discussing how more often you see relationships that involved certain types of men with certain types of women, but you don't often see the reverse of certain types of women within certain types of men. And this is one example. This movie is one example of that. But I wonder if you came up with any others during the break. And we're going to pick that conversation back up right now. Let's go back to the interview. Yeah, I was as you were talking, I was trying to think of examples myself and really not coming up with, I'm sure you're more
Well, I was, when I do a book like this, one of the things I do is that I give it to a few other writers who are entertainment mavens. And I'd go like, what did I get wrong? And I asked all of them, was there anything you can think of? And no one could think of anything else.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it's also there's an interesting thing there also where we completely accept that an ordinary looking man can find love with a gorgeous woman. But when it comes to the reverse, people are really, in interviews I've done for this book and talked to groups of people after we've screened the movie, there are still particularly a number of older men who have a problem with Barbra Streisand. How was she able to get Robert Redford? And it's very interesting to me, when the movie came out, it got basically mixed reviews. And a lot of the most influential male critics like Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, Vincent Canby in the New York Times, Stanley Kaufman, I forget where he was writing, but those were major male critics, hated the movie. And you know who the two big defenders of the movie were? Judith Crist at New York Magazine and Pauline Kael at New Yorker. Now, for younger people, they may not know those names, but those were not the two most influential female movie critics. Those were two of the most influential movie critics, period, at the time. And both of them used the same word to describe The Way We Were. It's enjoyable. And enjoyable is not a word that critics use a lot. But I believe that here were two women who were probably in their 40s at the time, who had sat through thousands of movies where Humphrey Bogart has no problem, attracting Ingrid Bergman. And yet the reverse we never saw, or they never saw. And so I think they found this movie very refreshing and, to quote them, enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
There's also another thing on that that's very interesting, because one of the interviews I did, I found the guy who edited the film, who was now in his 90s, and he said that The Way We Were was unique for him because whenever he would be introduced to people and they asked him what he did, and he says, I was a movie editor. And they say, well, what movies did you do? And he would give them a few titles. He said, invariably, the men said to him, I don't like the movie The Way We Were, but it's my wife's favorite movie.
Yeah, interesting. That's a dynamic for sure.
Yes.
Things go in cycles, of course, history, politics, etc., themes. Do you think this movie still speaks to audiences today?
Well, there's a couple of things going on there. Let's take the political side of it first. The movie was very controversial when it was made in 1972 because, let's face it, the Hollywood blacklist was created by Republican candidates in Congress. They were the ones who pushed it. And two of those people were Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan in 1947 was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he worked to establish the blacklist in Hollywood. In 1972, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. Richard Nixon in 1947 was a representative, and he sat on the House on Un-American Activities. In 1972, he was president of the United States. So here is a movie that is being developed in 1972 that is critical of the blacklist. So it was very controversial, and you have to realize a number of the big players in Hollywood who enforced the blacklist were still powerful. Key among them, the William Morris Agency, which I think in 1950 and in 1972 was probably the biggest agency out there. CAA kind of gives it a run for its money now, but it's still a huge agency. So those agents didn't want to be reminded of this. And it is very interesting to me that in the movie, the words Republican Party are never mentioned in the movie. And yet, I think the movie today is relevant for anyone who has a little bit of sense of history, that the Republican Party has a problem. It runs off the rails on a regular basis. It ran off the rails with Herbert Hoover. It ran off the rails with the blacklist. It ran off the rails with Watergate, I think, Reagan's response to the AIDS crisis, with George W. Bush's made-up war in the Middle East, and now with MAGA. So I think the movie speaks to that, even though the words Republican Party are not mentioned in it. What is a little bit different for the movie, and this is really much more a personal reaction, when I saw the movie in 1973, I really thought it was very much a Jewish Gentile kind of dynamic between the Streisand character and the Redford character. When I was working on this book, I saw it a little bit differently, and I think it is actually, that dynamic is still there, but there's something more universal, and that is within even a good marriage or in a good romance, there is one person who is more in love than the other person. There's one person who works harder to make it happen. There is one person who is more invested in the relationship than the other person. And of course, that is clearly Katie in the movie. And I think that's very universal.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. In terms of writing, I'm sure you must have done research and extensive interviewing. Can you talk about that process?
Well, the really great thing, I could have done this book without any interviews because the people who were involved with it had given so many interviews about the movie. What hadn't really been exposed was that Sidney Pollack had his archives at the Academy Library in Beverly Hills, the Academy Awards Library, and Arthur Lawrence had his archives at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And there were hundreds of memos and letters that these men wrote to each other, and they kept copies of the producer Ray Stark and what he wrote to them. So that was really the core of the book. But then luckily I did get interviews with Redford and Streisand, James Woods, who was in the movie. Also, I had interviewed Arthur Lawrence and Sidney Pollack when they were both alive. So I was able to use those interviews.
You've written in this space for a long time. What do you think about writing in the Hollywood movie, entertainment, et cetera, however you want to classify it, in that area? What draws you to writing there?
Well, I worked as an editor at magazines and newspapers for over 40 years, and I was always covering entertainment. So that is kind of what I know. And every once in a while I go, oh, that would really be interesting to write about, let's say, that fashion designer or that sports figure. But I don't have the context to do that. You know, it would really be starting from scratch. So I'm really kind of stuck in the entertainment world. It was interesting. A few years ago, I wrote a book on Dominic Dunn, who was a very famous writer for Vanity Fair, and he wrote a number of novels. And he covered a number of murder trials, O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brothers, Klaus von Bülow. That's what he was known for. And it really was fun to go into that world of courtroom crime drama because it was something I didn't know anything about. But luckily, those people who knew him were also reporters, and quite often reporters like to help other reporters out. So I had no problem getting to all of these reporters that Dominic Dunn worked alongside of. What is a problem are the editors. And editors, I always think, are very pampered people, even though I was one for 40 years. But they kind of let the writer out there, the reporter, go out and get the story and do all the dirty work. And then they sit at their desk and kind of, change a few words or whatever. And a number of editors who worked with Dominic Dunn would not speak to me. And I thought that was really kind of reprehensible because the only way an editor makes a living is if people talk to a reporter.
For people who maybe have seen the movie, maybe have not seen the movie, what else would you like them to know about this book?
I was very interested in the whole idea of, and it goes way beyond gay, but when someone from one group, whether that's homosexuals or Latinos or blacks or women or Jews, decides that they're going to write about someone from another class or group. And quite often they come into a lot of grief over that. I know that recently there was a biography of Martin Luther King, and it was written by a white man, and he was rejected by many publishers because they were like, well, we're not going to publish a book, biography of Martin Luther King if it's written by a white person. It has to be written by a black person. And of course, you get this all the time now within, there was even, I'm going beyond just writing, but there's even a musical on Broadway right now about Imelda Marcos, called Here Lies Love. And when it had its world premiere, I think about 10 years ago, Imelda Marcos was played by a Korean American actress. When they moved it to Broadway, they wanted to advertise it as an all Filipino cast. So she wasn't cast. And I was very interested bringing this back to the way we were, that here is Arthur Lawrence, a gay man, talking about, well, I am Katie Morosky. And that is something, certainly in 1973, when he was publicizing the movie, he could never say or reveal. And it was, particularly in the early 70s and the late 60s, it was a very sensitive subject because in the New York Times in 1966, the very famous critic Stanley Kaufman wrote an essay for the Sunday New York Times, and the essay was Homosexual Drama and Its Disguises. And he came right out and said that the most popular playwrights in America right now are homosexual, and they are writing plays that are a distortion of women and heterosexual marriage. And they should stop doing this. And if they want to write plays, they should write about themselves. And of course, he didn't say them by name, but what he was talking about is Tennessee Williams, William Inge, and Edward Albee. So during that period, the idea that you were a gay writer and you were writing about heterosexuals was you were immediately suspect. And that's why a number of writers remained in the closet. And I was very interested in looking at that. And I think with Arthur Lawrence, he was enough of an artist that he could make the transfer from a character that was inspired by himself, but he could make it genuinely female. And I think that I don't think he was writing about his relationship with Tom Hatcher. The relationship with Tom Hatcher lasted for 50 years. It was really a little bit different. I think he was writing probably more about his relationship with the movie star Farley Granger, whom he met in 1947 when the movie is set. Farley Granger was a very attractive man. He was not blonde, but he was a very attractive movie star. And they met on the set of Alfred Hitchcock's movie Rope. And they were together for 5 years. And then that relationship broke up when Farley Granger had an affair with one of Arthur Lawrence's friends, Leonard Bernstein. And if you know the movie The Way We Were, that relationship breaks up because Hubble has an affair with another woman. Now, that's kind of open to interpretation. But that is another thing that is interesting if you want to talk about the two scenes that Barbra Streisand wants to put back into the movie, because it has to do with Hubble sleeping with another woman.
So yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, to your point, it's fascinating that the critic was saying that the gay men should write more about their own relationships and not heterosexual relationships. But in 1973, that would not have done them any favors. So it's really...
It would not have done any favors, but it is interesting to note, and I knew Mark Crowley. Mark Crowley in 1966 read that essay in the New York Times, and he said, hey, you know what? I'm going to write about a bunch of gay men. And he wrote The Boys in the Band.
We are, in fact, going to talk about those two scenes that were cut. But before we do that, we're going to take our second break of this episode. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Robert Hofler as we talk about The Way They Were, about the making of The Way We Were. And before the break, he had just asked if we should talk about two of the scenes that were cut that he thinks are very important, maybe shouldn't have been cut, would have changed the tone of the movie quite a bit. So let's pick up with that conversation. Go ahead and talk about the two scenes that were cut. Go ahead.
Well, in the movie, the original script that Arthur Lawrence wrote, Hubble has a years-long affair with Bissinger's wife. And in the movie, Bissinger's wife is a woman named Vicky Bissinger, and she's played by a blonde actress named Diana Ewing. She's hardly in the movie. But he had an affair with her that went on for actually years. And Katie discovers it, I would say 2 or 3 months into the affair. They toned that way down for the movie. They made it a one-night stand with Lois Childs. And Lois Childs she's just broken up with Hubble's best friend, JJ. So it's just a one-night stand. But anyway, Katie has found out about it. They're in their cottage in Malibu, and he tells her it hasn't meant, the affair didn't mean anything. And then she says, well, stay with me until the baby is born. What was cut out is that Hubble, before she says, stay with me till the baby is born, before the baby is born, they've discussed his affair, but then he goes on to tell her that Frankie McVeigh, the James Woods character, whom was her communist comrade back in 1937 in college, has informed on her to the House of Un-American Activities. And Katie says in this scene that was cut, well, who am I? I'm nobody. And he says, yes, but you're married to me, and I can't work in Hollywood with a wife who's a communist. And she says, well, I'll stay with you. And he says, that won't solve anything. And she says, well, yes, it will. Just stay with me until the baby is born. Well, that kind of gives the movie a whole different,
completely different tone. Wow.
tone. And in my interview with Barbara Streisand, she says the way the movie is edited now, it's like she's leaving Hubble because he stooped, and that was her word. He had stooped a woman one night. I don't quite agree with that. I think that Hubble had sex with the Lois Childs character because he thought the marriage was already over. And from his point of view, he felt that Katie had broken her promise to him to not be political. And that was the deal they made when, he was ready to break up with her or had broken up with her. And then she can't sleep one night. And she phones him, and then she says, I love Alice Faye. I can live in Hollywood. So she has made this promise that she should not have, that she wasn't going to be political. What the film editor, John Burnett, told me was when they sat down to edit the movie, they realized that the movie started to become about the blacklist and those characters. And all that was really important for the movie is that Katie had to have a cause. In the 30s, it was Franco. In the 40s, it was the blacklist. In the 50s, it was Ban the Bomb. So I don't agree with her, with Streisand, that they break up. I feel like the marriage was already dissolving. And that's why he slept with Lois Childs for one night. There were memos I found between Sidney Pollack and Arthur Lawrence, which got to the heart of their conflict and why Sidney Pollack fired Arthur Lawrence from the movie, because they had to make the movie, the script, so that Robert Redford hated the project. He thought Hubble was a Ken doll. He didn't want to do it. He said no for 8 months. And finally, they convinced him. And basically, it was Sidney Pollack, who was a friend of his, says, I'll get the script in shape so you'll want to play it. And one of the things they did is that they beefed up his part, and they made the part so that you saw his point of view. And his point of view was, why should we destroy our lives in 1947 when 10 years from now, all of these screenwriters who are blacklisted are going to be rehired by the producers who fired them? And so let's just get on with our lives and not do this. And Katie, of course, doesn't see it that way. She sees what's right in front of her, and that, this is a problem that has to be taken care of. Getting back to these letters that Arthur Lawrence and Sidney Pollack wrote to each other before Lawrence got fired. Basically, the gist of the letters was that Sidney Pollack saw the movie as a tragedy, that the marriage of these two people fell apart from problems within, that there was a fault in the relationship, even though they loved each other. And the fault was that Katie made a promise she should not have made to Hubble. And that was, well, I'll give up politics, essentially, because she couldn't, because that was too important to her. Arthur Lawrence saw the movie more as a melodrama, that these were two people who were in love and their marriage could have survived, but there were these outside forces, HUAC and the Blacklist, that destroyed their marriage. And he said, I saw many people whose lives were destroyed by the Blacklist. So that was one scene that she wanted put back in. I actually have, if you want to see that, you can buy the 25th anniversary DVD of The Way We Were, the 25th anniversary edition. And it has 11 minutes of the movie that was cut out. An hour was cut out of the movie, but you can see 11 minutes. And those 11 minutes were what were screened on a Friday night in San Francisco at a preview in September. The movie came out in October. And when they screened it at 2 hours and 11 minutes, the movie was a dud. The next day, they cut out 11 minutes and the movie was 2 hours. And Saturday night, they had a big hit. So Sidney Pollack wasn't going to put anything back into that and mess around with the formula. The other little scene that was in there that kind of drives home the point that Katie realizes she made a mistake in moving to California with Hubble is that very near the end of the movie, she's very pregnant. She's driving across the UCLA campus and she sees a young co-ed who's speaking out against the Blacklist. And it reminds her of herself when she was in college and she was outspoken. And so that just kind of drives home the way I was, and I was a better person 10 years ago.
It's fascinating though when this movie, any movie, and how much they can change from initial concept to actual finished product, and how many people and steps are involved in those changes, why they come about, and the decisions behind those changes.
Well, it is amazing to me that there was an hour of the movie, most of it having to do with Hollywood, that was cut out, and I find it kind of amazing that that's a lot of money goes into filming an hour of a movie with Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford, and not to use that footage. Pollack told me the problem is that they could never get in the Hollywood section the romance and the politics to really mix well. And I think some of the problem with that, although it's not evident the way the film is cut, if you read the original screenplay or read Arthur Lawrence, before he wrote the screenplay, he wrote a novel called The Way We Were. He kind of wrote the screenplay and the novel concurrently. And that was published in 1972. And you can see, what the movie would have been. And there was a real problem with it. And I think some of the problem is, this movie kind of came at a crossroads where nowadays we expect the female character to have a career, to have a life, to have a job, to have a life beyond her husband and her kids. But that wasn't the case in 1973. And what happens with a number of the scenes, having read them in the novel and in the screenplays, is that you're like, well, why is Katie there in Hollywood? She's just a little reader. She's not someone who had enough clout in Hollywood to be talking to these people about the Blacklist and what they politically had to do. Now, I think something that could have been done is, although those Hollywood characters, although they've been pretty much cut out of the movie, it is a roman à clef. The Bissinger character, the director, is based on John Huston. John Huston is the one who led the effort to protest the Blacklist in Hollywood and went to Washington, D.C. And then Dalton Trumbo was one of the blacklisted writers. That's the Murray Hamilton character in the movie, who plays a screenwriter who's blacklisted. The Vivica Linford's character was based on Salka Bertel. And and she's a blacklisted screenwriter, as Salka Bertel was. And there were always these rumors that Salka Bertel had an affair with Greta Garbo. And that in the projection room, there's a time that Hubble uses a slur regarding the Vivica Linford's characters being a lesbian, but he uses a slur. And Katie goes, "Oh, no, she's got 2 grandchildren, you know." And then the other character, there's a red-haired actress. Her name is Alan Ann McCleary, and she plays Hubble's agent. And about the only scene that's left of her is she is in the cottage with Katie when they're playing volleyball out on the beach. And she says, "I can get Hubble a 3-picture deal. You can live in style." Katie says, "I thought we were living in style." That was based on an agent named Meta Rosenberg. And Meta Rosenberg was a former communist, and she did name names at HUAC. And in the original script, and this scene was shot, Katie sees the McCleary character at the farmer's market in Hollywood and calls her a name, or "You're a piece of crap," but she says something else because you name names. Meta Rosenberg was Robert Redford's agent in the 60s, and then she went on to be a very powerful producer. She did the Rockford Files with James Garner. So all of those are based on it. And I kind of feel that if Katie had actually been the Meta Rosenberg character and was an agent in Hollywood, because there were many female agents in Hollywood in the 40s, it would have made her more of a player, and people would have, but now there's a number of scenes that you're just kind of like, well, why is she there? No one would have been paying attention to her. She was somebody's wife. And she wasn't the wife. She was the wife of a screenwriter who was making his first movie. But if she would have been an agent, I know what Arthur Lawrence was doing. He made her like this producer on a radio show, because that's very visual. That's where, you know, the movie starts, and that's very visual. But he should have made her an agent. There was another scene that was cut out of the movie early in the movie, and that is right when she's in college and she wants her story read aloud in class. And instead the instructor reads Hubble's story, and she's devastated. A scene that was cut out is she goes to the professor's office, and he says to her, "You don't have any talent as a writer, but that doesn't mean you can't work in this business. My wife is an editor at a university press, and, you know, I don't have talent as a writer, but I teach writing. Maybe this is what you can do." So that was her kind of segue to go into the radio world. And also Arthur Lawrence knew that world because in World War II, he had worked in kind of radio propaganda for the Army. But I think it would have, although it wouldn't have been visual, if she would have somehow segued into being an agent, then she would have had the power to be in some of these scenes. I mean, there's one scene that was cut that this is what happened to Dalton Trumbo, who, you know, wrote Roman Holiday and other movies under pseudonyms, and he would give them to other writers, and then they would submit them, and then they would take some money, and then that's how he lived during that period, is other screenwriters submitted his work to the Hollywood studios. There is a scene where the Murray Hamilton character is trying to sell one of his screenplays to Hubble so that Hubble can in turn sell it to the studios. Well, Katie is along in that conversation. That doesn't make any sense. Why is she there? This is something between 2 writers. Why would she even be invited for something like that, which would be, you know, would take place in utmost secrecy? But the way it's edited now, it's not so obvious, because all that we kind of know is she's against the blacklist, and then the story's over.
It's time for our final break of the episode, and I know I probably already said this in some variation or other, but it really is interesting to me how much projects change and how much you can change the direction or the tone of a film just by taking out a scene or rewriting a scene just a little bit and how much it can change. So for me, that's always really fascinating in terms of how movies get made. But let's go ahead and take our final break. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Robert Hofler. In terms of writing, obviously you've written for a long time in various capacities. You mentioned that shifting gears. What was your initial impetus just to shift gears and decide to write for publication?
Well, I inherited some money, so I really didn't need a steady paycheck, and I was all, kind of on the verge of being able to collect Social Security, and the publication I was working for changed hands. So, the hands that it was being turned over to no longer, gave us, any kind of benefits. And so some of it was financial, that I was financially able to do it. Because you don't make a great deal of money writing the kind of books and writing theater reviews. But I live very nicely.
Sure. Do you have advice for people who want to write?
Well, it's very interesting with it, particularly with the man who invented Rock Hudson. No one wanted that story about Henry Wilson. And yet it sold very well. It was going to be turned into, I made a lot of money in Hollywood, it being optioned, and, it got quite a ways along. But it won't be turned into a movie now because essentially, Ryan Murphy, kind of took the story of Henry Wilson and put it into his Netflix story, Hollywood. My point of bringing all this up is that, everyone was like, well, who's Henry Wilson? And I think sometimes these little obscure stories can be far more interesting than writing, let's say, the 5th biography or the 10th biography on Cary Grant, even though it seems as though there are certain Hollywood icons that you can recycle every 10 years. But I think if you really believe in something, you should really kind of follow that. And if you think it's a good story, I think other people will think it's a good story too. I mean, that book was rejected absolutely everywhere. I mean, everyone rejected Money, Murder, and Dominic Dunn, which sold very well. I don't know why people didn't want that. It was eventually it was published by a university press, which doesn't give you much of an advance, but the book did very well.
From writing to reading, when you take time to read for yourself, what genres and authors do you prefer?
Well, I'm very much classics. I honestly don't know what is going on in the modern fiction world, and I'm not a big reader of biographies. It's very interesting to me because I'm a theater critic, but I don't write plays. And people say, well, how can you do that since you don't write plays? And I'm going like, yeah, well, I write biographies, but I have no interest in writing reviews of biographies. Your talents take you in certain areas. And I do think I have interesting things to say about the theater. I think a lot of times playwrights, if they were theater critics, And I think this would be true if I were writing reviews of biographies. I know what I do, and I would judge every biography according to the biographies I've written and what I was trying to achieve. Where when it comes to reviewing plays, I can be a little bit more objective. I'm kind of semi-retired. So here I'm writing books. I'm reviewing probably 120 plays a year. And the other thing I do, simply out of arrogance, because I always thought it would be very sophisticated to say that I was multilingual. I study a number of foreign languages, German, French, Italian, Spanish. And so when I read, I almost am always reading something in another language. I just finished Emile Zola's Nana in French, and I was reading some Sartre and I went through all sorts of Spanish literature. Spanish is the language I know the best. And I always thought there really wasn't that much great Spanish literature. And I was very wrong. There were just a lot of great, writers in the Spanish language.
Okay. Thank you. If people are interested in learning more about the book or some of your other writings, share a website and any social media that you're active on.
Well, there's roberthofler.com. And then I write for The Wrap, the WRAP, like the movie has wrapped. And that's, so if you went to Robert Hofler and The Wrap, it would call up all of the theater reviews that I have written. And the theater season here in New York has just taken off. So I filed a couple of reviews and am supposed to see something tonight. So that's kind of the first few reviews of what will be over 100 reviews between now and the end of April.
Okay, thank you. We've talked about a few different things during our time together today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure that you highlight?
It was very interesting to me. My interview with Redford was done via email, and that's always very chancy. You have to be very careful because you can't send a bunch of very controversial questions because the person can go like, oh, well, I'm not going to be interviewed by this guy. Because I interviewed him right at the beginning of the process, and at the end of the process, I sent him another email and I said, look, there's some things I've learned and I'd like to talk to you about this. One of them was, what I learned is that Arthur Lawrence had put out the story that Redford was very interested in the sequel and wanted the script for the sequel to be sent directly to him, Robert Redford. And Robert Redford said that was absolutely untrue. He was never interested in making the sequel, that he thought it was a one-off. And so he was never interested in that. And I believed him on that. Arthur Lawrence was quite a fabulist. He made a lot of stuff up. One of the things he made up was that he was really not blacklisted, but that kind of fit into his mythology. He was in Hollywood in 1955, living at the Chateau Marmont on the dime of the studios because he was, working on scripts. So he wasn't blacklisted, but that fit into, his narrative for himself. But it was interesting to me with Redford because there was two questions I asked him that he would not answer. And one was about his former agent, Meta Rosenberg, that he would not answer any questions about her. And I was curious how he felt because he must have known that this character was based on his former agent. That former agent was still alive, and how would she have felt to have this movie be very critical of her? But he didn't want to talk about any of that. Of course, almost all of her part was cut out, so it was kind of a moot point anyway. But more to the point was, there was a huge fight that broke out between Redford, Ray Stark, the producer, and Sidney Pollack, there are two love scenes between Streisand and Redford. One is the one where he falls asleep on top of her. And then there is a second love scene that takes place in front of a fire. You're not even quite aware it is a love scene, even though they do kiss, because it just kind of dissolves into this montage of them running around in the streets of New York and having a good time. But at the end of that scene, to cue that they were really going to make love a second time, is he was supposed to say, "It'll be better this time," meaning that he acknowledged that the first time was not good. And Redford refused to say that line. And Ray Stark just wrote dozens of memos about how they had to put that line into the movie. And he didn't care if they went over budget. He wanted the scene reshot with that. And Redford just absolutely refused to say it. And even to this day, he would not tell me why he refused to say the line. He also refused to say at the end of the movie when Katie runs her fingernails, her very, very long fingernails through his bangs the last time in front of the Plaza Hotel, he's supposed to say gray. But I guess if Robert Redford is never bad in bed, he's never going to go gray either.
Interesting. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, Robert, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the book and the movie and your interest in the movie enough to write the book. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you once again for Robert to take the time to speak to me about this book and the making of the movie. As I said at the beginning, if you are a movie fan, if you're a fan of this movie, first off, then you probably want to read this book and learn more about the making of it and the behind the scenes. Or maybe you are just a fan of film in general and the making of film and how that process works and all of the changes that goes into this. And there is so much that went into the making of this movie and so many different moving parts and people and egos and all of those things. So it really is kind of fascinating how all of that came together to make a movie that has really stood the test of time. It is still very popular 50 years later. I have spoken to a few people about this interview and the book, and this is what I'm doing this week, and they're like, "Oh, I love that movie, Streisand and Redford. How can you go wrong?" So it really is quite interesting to me how that all came about. So thank you to Robert, and thank you as always to you for joining me. I hope you'll join me for the next episode when, one of those crazy coincidences, we are talking about another movie next week. I have never interviewed an author about a book, about a movie before, and now I've got two in a row, which is crazy. Mark Leslie will be returning to the podcast. We discussed fiction last time, and now this time we are doing it's a very different book than the one we talked about last time. So today's book and interview were about The Way We Were. Next week's book is about Die Hard. And the book, we're going to have to talk about how we're going to discuss that, because as you know, this is a non-swearing podcast. And the title of the book is that famous line from Die Hard, "Yippee-ki-yay, mother, you know what." Now, I'm not averse to dropping an F-bomb or 10 in real life, but as you know, I don't swear on the podcast, and so we will not be saying that word. So we'll have to be creative about how we discuss the book and its contents, but it just makes me laugh. It's going to make me laugh every time I say "Yippee-ki-yay, mother." We'll see how Mark does it without saying the actual word. Should be interesting. So join me for that conversation. In the meantime, like, follow, subscribe. Make sure you're getting all of the newest episodes. If you are amenable, a review never goes amiss. Please leave a written or starred review to help me get the podcast out to more lovely listeners such as yourselves. And follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love, love, love hearing from you. So come find the podcast and me on social media. Hope you are having a wonderful week. Hope it is off to a great start. I hope your October is off to a great start. Your spooky season, if you are a fan of this time of year. I hope that you're, everything pumpkin, right? And enjoying reading ghost stories or cozy mysteries or thrillers or whatever you like to do this time of year. I hope that you are doing that, and that's what I always say, right? I hope that you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in as many spooky season books as you could stand up to. Talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.